Gen Z doesn't want to work. This is a phrase you've likely heard at some point in the last few years. Hiring managers have said it, bosses have said it, and your parents have probably said it. It's not necessarily a new feeling. Since the dawn of humanity, people have enjoyed ragging on the younger generation. I found this quote from 1925. It says, "We defy anyone who goes about with his eyes open to deny that there is, as never before, an attitude on the part of young folk, which is best described as grossly thoughtless, rude, and utterly selfish." I found this quote from the 1700s. They said this: "Whither are the manly vigour and athletic appearance of our forefathers flown? Can these be their legitimate heirs? Surely no. A race of effeminate, self-admiring, emaciated fribbles can never have descended in a direct line from the heroes of Poitiers and Agincourt." And I even found another example from further back. In the 4th century BC, Aristotle said young people are high-minded because they have not been yet humbled by life, nor have they experienced the force of circumstances. They think they know everything and are always quite sure about it. For quite literally thousands of years, people have hated on young people as soon as they're no longer young. However, this time might actually be a little different. As much as it pains me to say, this time might be a little different. We've actually got data specifically from Monitoring the Future, which is a survey that's done every year. It assesses 17 and 18-year-olds in the US to collect data about their beliefs, their attitudes, and things like that. It's actually been running since the 70s, and there are a few questions related to the world of work in there. One item asks young people how willing they would be to work overtime at work. And as you can see, it's just fallen off a cliff. And it seems to actually be some of the earliest concrete evidence that the youth has much less of a work ethic than the older generation. And obviously no generation is like a monolith, and every individual has their own feelings and their own motivations when it comes to work. But clearly something has changed, because there are a series of questions related to the world of work in this survey, and they all broadly show this similar pattern. Now, obviously, without a doubt, part of this is financial, right? And who can really blame them when we look at that side of things? Despite the fact that young adults have this increasingly negative attitude towards working overtime and going above and beyond at their jobs, they're actually more likely to be working full time than young adults were 30 years ago. However, despite the fact that they are more likely to be working full time, they're also more likely to be in debt. They're more likely to be single and spend more time alone. And they're a lot more likely to have not achieved the markers of adulthood that their parents might have. You know, like all of the usual stuff. Amongst Gen Z in particular, those that are working longer hours than previous generations. But those that aren't working are actually dropping out of the labour force entirely. The labour force participation rate is at a pretty significant low point, which means that people are not choosing to stay unemployed and look for work. They're instead choosing to drop out of the labour force completely. And so we've got these two groups of Gen Zers, those that are working and hate it, and those that aren't working and are giving up completely on the workforce. Now, the drop in labour force participation rate is in large part due to a big rise in disability, which has disproportionately affected young people. But even amongst the ones who are actually working, the mood has really soured. And it's not entirely due to the finances. And there's one question on this survey that really tells us that. So one of the questions on this Monitoring the Future survey, this survey of 17 and 18-year-olds, is as follows. If you were to get enough money to live as comfortably as you'd like for the rest of your life, would you want to work? The interesting thing about this question is that it strips away all of the financial side of things. And it helps us get to the core of whether or not kids actually want to work at all, irrespective of whether or not they feel underpaid. And over here, the data doesn't look as great either. It's worth acknowledging that the majority of young people do still want to work, but we are still at an all-time low for this survey, which started in the 70s. Even when we ignore the financial aspect of it, we still see that we have fewer young people who have an intrinsic desire to work than ever before. And this seems to suggest that something a bit more fundamental has actually changed. But we have to be honest with ourselves and ask ourselves whether this is an issue with just young people or with everyone. And despite the fact that young people have been hit the hardest by this drop in a desire to work, it seems to have been affecting a broader group than just young people. Gallup, the research company, carries out an annual survey of employee engagement, and they've even noticed that employee engagement across all age groups has sunk to a 10-year low, and less than 1 in 3 people say that they feel engaged at work in the US. Now, this 31% figure is pretty decent when you compare it globally. In Canada, there's only 21% employees who are engaged. In Mexico, it's 32%. And over in China, only 20% of employees report being actively engaged in their job. And so the situation is not really great anywhere in terms of employee engagement. In their further research, Gallup does this thing. They have a set of 12 questions that they ask about how people feel at work in terms of things like fulfillment, support, companionship, and other factors. Things like, how satisfied are you with your company as a place to work? Do you know what's expected of you at work? Do you have friends at work? And do you feel like you're given opportunities to learn and grow? And it's really inside these questions that we start to see a little bit more about how people feel about the workplace. One that particularly surprised me is that less than half of US employees say that they know what's expected of them at work. I think this is interesting because employees that don't have clarity are way more likely to feel confused, frustrated and disengaged, as well as not having good morale and productivity. Another question asks, do US employees feel cared for at work? On the whole, US employees felt a lot less cared for after the pandemic than they did beforehand. For some people, I think there are a few factors that can affect this, whether it's being laid off during the pandemic, or simply just having time and space away from their job to think about how they're being treated. US employees specifically have really changed their opinion of how well their workplace treats them, and seem to have realized that they could have it a lot better than they do now, which obviously would lead to disengagement. The third piece of data, the third question that I thought really was worth mentioning, was the idea of a sense of mission and purpose. And more than ever, people are feeling a greater disconnect between their job and a greater sense of purpose, which clearly created around the pandemic as well. And when your job isn't paying you enough to live, you need at least something else to motivate you. You can think of the spectrum of jobs from, say, working for a charity to working for a bomb manufacturer. One of those jobs would ideally provide a lot of meaning in lieu of proper pay, whereas the other job would probably provide more pay and not necessarily quite as much meaning. But it seems like more and more people are getting neither. Something that likely a lot of people realized across the pandemic, that the job of their company was to make money. And it's interesting that it was going up before the pandemic. It seems that in a time of relative stability, people could identify more with the broader goals of their company. However, the pandemic really gave people a chance to reevaluate it. You've got a perfect recipe for disengagement, and this disengagement is more vocal than ever. Today, people can go on social media and have those feelings validated by millions of other people in a way that they wouldn't have been able to in 2005. If you thought that your workplace didn't care about you, you would likely not be brave enough to mention it. But today you can just post a TikTok and it'll go viral, and you'll have people who will actually affirm and validate those feelings, which is why I think they've permeated down to younger people so effectively. It's no longer this secret that is held for people until they join the workplace. Younger people have a better and better understanding of what awaits them when they enter the real world, and seem to be pre-compensating for that in some regards. All of this is to say that the willingness for Gen Z to not work overtime isn't really the only change that we're seeing. It's not just that they don't want to push themselves and go above and beyond at work. It's that they've had a fundamental rethink of the role of work in their life. Because it's not just that they are less willing to work overtime, they're also less likely to expect their work to be satisfying in any way at all. And notably, they're much less likely to expect work to be a central part of their life. It's been a trend that's been accelerated by the pandemic, but has been in no small part happening beforehand. Specifically, if we focus on the blue line, the idea that work should be a central part of the person's life. This idea has been trending downwards since the very start of this survey. Since 1976, people have less and less believed that work should be really important to them, and that work should be the guiding light of their lives. And so the willingness to work overtime and the low work ethic isn't just a result of them being lazy. It's a result as well of somewhat of a fundamental rethink of the role of work in their lives. It clearly seems like the younger generation has realized or has a feeling that their work will not give them the sense of mission or purpose that they need to feel fulfilled. And I think that's part of why you see more and more stories about things like quiet quitting, where employees are deliberately telling each other to do the bare minimum of their job requirements and no more. Or even task masking, where employees are making themselves look busy in the absence of real work, because they've come to realize that they're not getting paid to actually work, they're getting paid to look productive, to whoever's assessing them. When the jobs can provide neither money nor mission, there's very little motivation beyond getting as much as you can from the employer as quickly as you can. And you can't really blame them. They've not been helped by the fact that anytime something positive has happened for workers, like the huge shift towards remote work, those rights have been taken away from them as soon as possible and have served to greater divide the employer and the employee and to greater illustrate to the employee how little power they really have at work. And in an environment like that, like, you just got to get your bag and get out. Thankfully, today we have technology and people have actually been able to express themselves honestly online and have those feelings validated in a way that they weren't validated for most of history. It's just the perfect recipe for disillusionment. And workers are doing what makes sense for them, which is to play the game to their advantage as best as possible and to get whatever they can out of it. The last thing I do want to leave you with is this other graph from the survey, which I thought was quite interesting because this plots the responses to the question, do you think that not wanting to work hard will be an obstacle to getting your chosen job? And this has also fell off a cliff. Now, I think this one's interesting because it seems to imply that the youth have an impression that progress in the workplace isn't necessarily tied to working hard. You could view this one of two ways. You could just say that the young are delusional and think they're going to get everything that they want. Or you could view it another way, which is that they're better able to recognize that the fruits of their labor are not necessarily driven by the amount of work they put in, but by other extrinsic factors that can make it easier to progress in the workplace. To me, this seems to imply that more and more people are aware that a skill is only really one part of a job. That knowing the right people and being liked by the right people is arguably equally important. And no matter what the case actually is, it's pretty clear that there's been quite a fundamental shift, and work ethic is way more complicated than how hard you try at work. There are multiple different aspects of your life that require work. Maintaining, romantic and family relationships requires good work ethic. And it could simply be that people are reserving their energy reserves for those things, as opposed to using their work ethic to make money in an office. Hey yo, thanks for watching. If you feel like you learned something and you want another way to support the channel that's completely free, please consider joining my Patreon. It is linked in the description below and probably in the corner of the screen somewhere. I'm trying to make an effort to create some community outside of YouTube, and if that sounds like it might be up your street, then head on over. Did I mention it's free? Yes, it's free. Yeah, come on, click on it, okay? Okay, love you. Bye-bye. Take care.